Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Christophe Courchain, Faculty Director of the Environmental Law Center and Associate Dean for Environmental and Experiential Programs here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Each of our talks this summer is worth one Vermont CLE credit, so please keep track of which talks you attend for your records. We'll have time for Q&A after today's presentation, and for those of you watching live on VLGS YouTube, please feel free to enter your questions in the chat space on the right-hand side of the page at any time, and we will get through as many questions and discussion points as we can. Today, we are honored to welcome Kristen. Kristen Stilt is a professor of law and the faculty director of the Brooks McCormick Jr. Animal Law and Policy Program and the faculty director of the Program on Law and Society in the Muslim World at Harvard Law School. Prior to coming to Harvard, Professor Stilt was the Harry R. Horo Professor in International Law, Northwestern Law School, and Professor of History at Northwestern University. Her research focuses on Islamic law and society in both historical and contemporary contexts, and she also writes in the area of animal law and the intersection of animal law and religion and culture in particular. She was named a Carnegie Scholar for her work on constitutional Islam, and in 2013 was awarded a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship. She's also received awards from Fulbright and Fulbright-Hays. Professor Stilt received a JD from the University of Texas School of Law, where she was an associate editor of the Texas Law Review and co-editor-in-chief of the Texas Journal of Women in the Law. And she holds a PhD in History and Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University. Professor Stilt joins us at VLGS this week and next as our 2025 Distinguished Animal Law Summer Scholar, and we are very, very honored to have her. Today, she will present Someone. Please join me in welcoming Kristen Stilt.
Okay. Thank you so much, Christophe. I'll jump right in, but of course, if I'm not loud enough or other things like that, please just correct me. But thank you so much, VLGS and Professor Delcy Winders, for the invitation to be here with you for 2 weeks this summer. I also want to thank, of course, Christophe Courchain and Brian Bashaw, who just introduced me and set up the video, as well as Laura Ireland for details of being here, and Brooks Fellows, LLM students Lana Nash and Carlos Contreras Lopez for the warm welcome upon my arrival, and everyone else here in the Environmental Law Center who made arrangements for me so that I could be here in this amazingly gorgeous and supportive environment. Thank you all very, very much. It's just incredible to be here talking to you about a topic that I think will touch everyone in some way, regardless of you're an animal law person, an environmental law person, or just care about the world we live in today. So the title of the talk is Someone, Human and Non-Human Animals in the Anthropocene. So a few little quick introductory comments. The presentation is based on an article in progress with Bonnie Nadzam. So the research is still ongoing, the conclusions are tentative, and all of your comments and questions will be extremely valuable as we continue this work. And also, the origins of the project are an ongoing criminal trial in California, in which I've argued in an amicus brief that the defendants should be entitled to raise the necessity defense, which I'll talk about later, for the rescue of suffering animals from factory farm confinement. And this is a very interesting situation, and one that just shows how important it is to have a hand in the practical world and the academic world, because the origins came from a very tangible criminal case that's now on appeal and has very significant consequences, not only for the defendants, but for animal law at large. And then that idea then took me into lots of different directions, and now is coming more fully into this piece of scholarship that I hope will be impactful in the real trial world, and also changing hearts and minds in the way they think about some of these really important questions that I'll talk about. And then all the pictures are either open source or from We Animals with permission. So What to say about the Anthropocene? Um, Humans and animals, and really the human-animal relationship that we are addressing in this project, are in the context of the here and now. And it helps to be specific that the current times we are in are aptly referred to by many as the Anthropocene. It may not be a hotel you want to check in, but we don't have a choice. We're all in it. What is the Anthropocene? Well, it's not recognized as a geological epoch, although geologists may revisit that, but still widely understood as a useful descriptor for the world today that we live in. And the human footprint on the earth, this image, I think is a very apt way to think about it. One aspect of the Anthropocene is attempts by humans to dominate and control everyone and everything else. Here again, the image of chickens raised in high capacity industrial facilities is also a very apt image, characteristic of the Anthropocene, with humans controlling or attempting to control every aspect of these animals' lives and deaths, as if we can control that, right? And that's really the catch, which is that holding on to an idea of human exceptionalism and a separation between humans and the natural world is futile, it's misguided, and it's what's gotten us to this place. The image is from a New York Times article from this past weekend, which is really quite interesting. It actually goes into property law details. I teach property, so I'll be glad to use this in my next property class. But I think it's interesting to anyone thinking about the Anthropocene and humans' attempts to deny it and forestall it. So the image, as the caption says, is a seawall in front of a home in Newport, Rhode Island, and researchers estimate that about a third of the world's sandy coastlines have already been armored. And this picture is so poignant because you see this woman holding up her hand as if to say, "Stop, sea, don't come any closer to my house," as if we have the ability to stop the events that we have started already due to our own actions. So in these times, these very difficult times in which those of us who care about the future of our planet and all its inhabitants, in these times, what possibly could I say about human-animal relationships that is not just doom and gloom? No, thank you, you might say. I've heard enough of that. But before you get out of this virtual talk, I'm going to take a turn here, perhaps a surprising turn. Some effects of our human attempts to dominate animals in the natural world, which are rooted in beliefs and values that distinguish us as somehow categorically distinct, right? Like the woman here. No, the sea is out there. Just keep it away. Some of the very things we've done are rendering us all increasingly vulnerable to disease and natural catastrophe, and less able to draw a sharp line between our own lives and bodies and the lives and bodies of those with whom we share the planet. As the effects of the Anthropocene bring humans and animals in closer and more frequent contact, increasingly in emergency and catastrophic situations, fires, floods, we are beginning to see signs of awareness, or more signs, that humans and animals are not only ecologically, but profoundly at the deepest levels interdependent. So the argument of our paper, just put here very succinctly, and I would say a little bit tentatively, is that the ground is shifting, literally and figuratively. So once we look outside the spotlight of the big and indeed important animal rights cases, subtler change is happening. And far from securing human separation from nature, emerging effects and realities of the Anthropocene include significant changes to natural cycles, rain, heat, etc., that reveal what has always been our fundamental interdependence with all life forms. So that's a little bit perhaps lofty sounding, but it will become clear through the course of the next 25 minutes or so. But to say it in other words here as well, we are reaching such extreme situations that the ground is shifting upon which we humans have built the structures of law and policy that place animals exactly where we want them, appropriate for the time and context as determined by us, right? You go to the zoo, you're in the factory farm, right? The structure we've created and the law and policy that we've used to hold it into place, right? Now, I don't want to overstate this shifting ground. We're not witnessing a revolution, at least not yet. But when we humans are confronted with choices in a time of crises, the choices we make can look far different than what we might expect our legal system that we've built to dictate. Even now, in some cases that I'll talk about today, an animal is not a something, but rather a someone. And that, of course, is the title of the presentation. And I'll tell you a little bit later where the word someone comes from, inspired us in this context. Rather than a something, an animal is a someone whose sentience is recognized by the law, a someone who merits the same or similar treatment in the same or similar kinds of situations in humans. And we're observing that in this paper and in our research, especially in these times of crises or catastrophic events. Almost as if when a push comes to shove in a very difficult situation, a lot of the layers of law and policy that separate us from them sort of fall apart. And that's the shifting ground that we're talking about. Okay, all right, so let's get into some details here. So let's consider a parking lot full of parked and closed cars, windows rolled up. And it's a warm and sunny day, sort of like it is here now, but let's assume it's hotter. When a car is parked with the windows up, the sun's shortwave radiation passes through the windows, but lands on objects in the car. The dashboard, the seats, the steering wheel, and those rapidly heat up, 200 degrees Fahrenheit even. For the objects inside the car, they too heat up by conduction and convection. Those objects emit long-wave radiation, which heats up the inside of the car. That's just a little short science explanation of saying that in 80-degree weather, the inside of a car can reach 123 degrees within an hour. So we're talking about cars heating up very quickly here, as they do all over the US, especially in the hotter states. So what happens if someone is in that car? What would you do if you were to encounter a parked car with children inside on what seems a normal day? Imagine it's you seeing this child. You're just running a quick errand. You see a vehicle that appears rather new. Let's say a hybrid minivan, for example. A toddler is buckled into her car seat. She has a sippy cup next to her, water, perhaps you can't quite tell, and a board book in her lap, but she appears to be asleep. You scan the parking lot. There's no adult in sight. It's 10 a.m., far from the hottest point in the day. You have no way of knowing how long the child has been in the car, where the guardian is, or if the guardian knows they left the child in the car. The doors are locked. Do you take the time to call 911? Do you cross the parking lot into one of these buildings to try to find someone, security? How many of us would immediately search for something heavy and break through a front window to take out the child? How many of us would pause, walk on, imagining the enraged parent who, upon completing a 5-minute errand, after having struggled for hours to get this child to nap, finds the child in the arms of a stranger with the car window smashed. But this situation is not speculative fiction. It's too often a reality. It's called pediatric vehicular heat stroke. According to the organization that charts this, more than 1,000 children have died in these situations since 1988. The vast majority took place in the southern half of the United States, and half the children were under the age of 2. Children are particularly susceptible. Their body temperature can rise much faster than that of an adult. 104 degrees is heat stroke. 107 degrees can cause death. Rising temperatures in the world, of course, make this problem worse. I gave you the example of an 80-degree day turning into 123 degrees inside the car. But an 80-degree day is no longer really the norm in many parts of the United States. In Phoenix, the average summer temperature exceeds 100. At that temperature, the car inside is 137, and the child could die in minutes. So in most states, it's punishable, potentially by criminal prosecution, to leave a child under the age of 6 unattended in a car, with some exceptions. But that doesn't necessarily stop what we're talking about here. The state of California, which in this year alone has already had the 3rd and 12th child death, the state of California in 2020 adopted a law to exempt a person from civil liability and criminal liability for property damage or trespass to a motor vehicle if the property damage or trespass is caused by rescuing a child 6 years of age or younger from a car under situations that could cause suffering, disability, or death to the child, assuming that the person takes certain steps, like calling the police, trying to do some other steps that are enumerated in the law. Okay. So this law, which we might call the Child Vehicle Confinement Law, is based on the idea that there's good Samaritans out there, but they might hesitate to act without very clear assurances and protections. And that hesitation might cause a child their life. Right? Now, let's go back to that parking lot for a minute. Now imagine you're crossing through it and encounter the same new minivan, but inside is a golden retriever, not a child. Imagine the dog sitting up, nose pressed against the window. The window's 1 inch down, but the dog's panting. The doors are locked. You see no water for the dog. For a moment, you turn. You look at the dog. What do? Attempting to remove this dog from this car today could mean a lot of trouble for a lot of people, including you. Well, in fact, a lot of people, including legislators in California, have already thought about just this problem. So in California, the child vehicle confinement law I just told you about was not written anew. It was actually drafted and copied from a pre-existing law, one done for animals, the animal vehicle confinement law. The only things that were changed when the legislature subsequently did the child vehicle confinement law is that child was substituted for animal, and the reference to humane officer and animal control officer as people you would call were removed. Okay, so what's the point? What's the point of showing you this, right? That we have an animal law and then we have a child law that duplicates it. Well, let me just say a little bit more about the animal vehicle confinement law. So it too started originally as a rule saying you may not leave your dogs in a car on a hot day in which the animal is likely to suffer. And the law allowed law enforcement to break into the vehicle to remove the animal, but was silent on what a bystander could do without suffering from some kind of liability. And animals continued to die and suffer, leading to legislative efforts to amend the law along with public awareness events. So all of this learning that was done in the animal context is then adopted wholesale in the child context. The amendment's author, when incentivizing individuals to break into car windows to save dogs, said that unfortunately, these cases are not always the top priority of our law enforcement, and they may not arrive in time to save the animal's life. Meanwhile, the Good Samaritan citizen is left standing by, watching an animal suffer, scared to act out of legitimate fear of repercussions. So the amendments to the vehicle confinement law were intended to provide specific guidance to bystanders and encourage them to essentially break into car windows, as long as they followed steps that were similar to the ones outlined, that would be then outlined in the child law, such as having a good faith belief that it's necessary, contacting law enforcement, remaining with the animal in a safe location, using no more force than necessary to enter the vehicle, and other sort of common sense instructions. Okay. So let's say a little bit more about the vehicle confinement law. Again, remembering that it serves as the basis for the child vehicle confinement law. The vehicle confinement law protects all animals who may be confined in a vehicle. While in many or even most cases, the need for it may pertain to situations when humans take their dogs as the most obvious companion animal to travel along in a car. But it's not limited to dogs or even to companion animals. It does not exclude any species, which indicates that the state recognizes that any animal who may be left in a vehicle could suffer significant bodily harm depending on the conditions in which the animal was left. In fact, the legislature chose not to exclude any species of animal from the statute after considering doing so. The legislative history notes state from one committee: the authors may wish to amend this bill to apply to only domesticated or household animals, so as to avoid any unintended consequences or confusion as to damage caused to a motor vehicle hauling, for example, livestock, horses, or other agricultural animals. But the language of the law is passed. The legislature did not specify that it had to apply to only dogs, for example. There is indeed a carve-out for traveling with large transport trucks. So that would exclude rescuing animals in large transport trucks, in which they are generally, of course, headed to slaughterhouses, and that's an unfortunate carve-out. But it's also very important that they did not exclude certain species from the law as written. So again, where does all of this take us? So a pig traveling in a car could be subject to this law, allowing someone to, for example, rescue not only a pet pig, but also someone who's transporting a pig from their farm to an auction, for example, for sale to a slaughterhouse, and parks the car or vehicle in a way that violates the law. The law uses the general language "an animal," which can only be interpreted to apply to any species capable of being confined in a vehicle. So what does all of this now tell us, now that I've showed you that we have a child vehicle confinement law, which many of you would think, well, yeah, of course we do. That would be expected. But now you know that that wasn't the original source, but rather the animal vehicle confinement law was the original law upon which the child law was mimicked. And then now knowing that the vehicle confinement law for animals is not even specific to a dog or other companion animals. So this is what I take from this particular example, and then we'll go on to a second example. I think there's a powerful and deeply considered evidence that these lawmakers perceive not a fundamental division between humans and animals, but a fundamental sameness. The laws recognize a fundamental legal similarity, not only between a beloved dog and a toddler, but also between a family dog or a toddler, or even an animal raised for human consumption. The laws tell us that anyone who's being transported in a vehicle in conditions of heat and neglect is someone. The laws tell us that this someone, whether a human, a dog, a goat perhaps, or maybe other species, merits immediate rescue. And the law tells us that the laws will protect the human who chooses, under the conditions described in the law, to take action to rescue them. Okay. So now you may be thinking, well, that does all sound quite interesting and maybe impressive that the legislatures are recognizing some fundamental shared ability to suffer and die, and that it is the policy of the state of California to want to avoid that. But how much can I make of these vehicle confinement laws? Is it just in California? And how do we go from there to some larger argument about the Anthropocene? Well, our research is showing that it's not just California. There's some 13, 14 states that have laws like this. And we're still investigating the relationship between animal confinement and toddler child confinement in these states to see how they may be linked. But I want to go on then to the next example, which is not one of existing law, but one in which we are pushing and hopeful that in this ongoing California trial, an interpretation of someone will be adopted to apply to animals. Okay. And this is the heart of the amicus brief of the case that I told you about at the beginning that sparked this line of research. Okay. So now we're not talking about a car. We're not talking about suffering in a car, but we're talking about newborn piglets on a factory farm. Again, from We Animals, a mother trying to provide her baby piglets access to her milk in a quote unquote farrowing crate. And as we all know, many of those piglets do not survive even those first days. So imagine you had reason to believe that there were imperiled lives on this particular factory farm, with the clock ticking against their imminent deaths of at least a number of these piglets, the ones who can't fight against their siblings to get access to the milk, since, as we know, more and more piglets are being born to pigs for the purpose of profit. Entering the facility, you intend to rescue any such piglets in dire straits. And let's say that you find two who are born too weak to jostle with their siblings. The mother also has a nipple condition, let's say, so common in industrial agriculture of mastitis, causing a bloody discharge in diminished milk. These two piglets are dying from lack of nutrition. You know they're in there. You've seen the footage. Right? Maybe you can even see them through a window. You call the police to report animal cruelty. The police do not come. They laugh at you. You know the piglets will not live long. Do you enter? Do you gather them in your arms and take them to receive the vet care they critically need? Are you in the same situation as someone looking in the window of a car and seeing a dog dying? Trespass and theft are just two of the potential charges if you are to enter into this facility. The reality is some advocates for animals do just this. They do not have a vehicle confinement law to rely on. And for reasons that perhaps we could discuss, they're not considered first responders in an emergency situation, right? A firefighter who enters a home that's on fire. But out of a sense of obligation to help these animals, they enter the facility, document what they see, and take dying piglets with them. They film the event, they inform the police what they have done, in what they call open rescue. Now, the question is, what happens at trial? Is there anything that can be relied upon to say what we're doing is very much like what you're doing when you break the window of a car to rescue a dog? There is such a doctrine. And let's talk about that in our last few minutes together before we turn to the questions and answers. And it's called the necessity defense. So this next slide is going to lay out the necessity defense in California. It's going to have a lot of words on it, but we'll talk about it, and I'll focus on the one that I think is most important, at least from my perspective, in terms of what I can do to weigh in and hopefully show the court where the law should be. Okay. First, though, I will tell you that the necessity defense does not negate any element of the crime, but rather represents a public policy decision not to punish a defendant despite proof of the crime. So it works at a different point in a case than the vehicle confinement law, which tells the person, if you do these particular steps, you will have immunity up front. We will not prosecute you. The necessity defense comes into play when you're already in court. And the question is, can you get a jury instruction so that the jury can consider the necessity defense, which would say, as a public policy matter, we are not going to punish you. Okay, so here we go for California. Now, this is the jury instruction. And as we all know, there's jury instructions, there's case law, there's lots of sources of law, but I'm going to stick with the jury instruction just for purposes of this talk. What is the necessity defense? So the defendant is not guilty of the particular crime, let's say trespass and theft at a factory farm, if he or she acted because of legal necessity. Now, how do you prove that? So here's the elements in the jury instruction. It was an emergency to prevent a significant bodily harm or evil to himself or herself or to someone else, right? And that someone is where the title of the talk comes from. That he or she had no adequate legal alternative, that the defendant's acts did not create a greater danger than the one avoided, that the defendant believed that the act was necessary to prevent the threatened harm or evil, that a reasonable person would also have believed that the act was necessary under the circumstances, and the defendant did not substantially contribute to the emergency, him or herself. Okay, so those are a lot of elements, and our defendants, our hypothetical defendants here, although they're not so hypothetical, would need to prove that to a jury by a preponderance of the evidence. So I'm going to focus, as I did in my amicus, on the first one. Right? To be clear, 2 through 6 also have to be proved, and those are also important. But for my purposes, for weighing in on this case, my argument is that someone else includes, in the state of California, under their own laws, an animal. And indeed, it could include any animal in the kind of distressful situation as outlined. Okay. So how do I argue that? Let's take this one step at a time. So we might argue based on the actual text itself. You may be preventing significant bodily harm or evil to your own self or someone else, right? Meaning some other individual who also has a body that can suffer harm. In this context, then, someone else does not refer to inanimate objects, such as a car, a home, an iPhone, or other items in that category. If you try to argue this on the grounds that you are protecting a car, it seems that this would not go anywhere. But I think it's clear that someone else refers to someone who can experience bodily harm. Now, to say that as a textual matter is fine, but what do we have to show that the state of California thinks that animals can suffer significant bodily harm? Well, here we would just refer right back to the vehicle confinement law and say that that law itself is a clear indication by the state of California that animals, not just companion animals, not just dogs, are sentient beings who can feel pain and can suffer bodily harm, just like humans can suffer bodily harm and feel pain. I don't think we would need to prove anyone that someone else could include a friend you're protecting, right, in a necessity situation, or a child. But to say that an animal is someone else is something that has never been decided by the state of California. But the other laws, the vehicle confinement law, and others that I can discuss if we have time, show that the state has already determined that animals can suffer and indeed then should be someone else for purposes of the necessity defense. All right, so I want to then offer some tentative conclusions to you and then have plenty of time to talk. So what I've given you is examples of laws that we already exist in California about vehicle confinement, and then the necessity defense, which has not been decided in the state as to its application to animals. But that is the trial, the appeals trial, that is beginning in just a few weeks. And I believe strongly that under the state's own public policy and precedent, someone else should include animals. All right, so let's take this back around to the larger project that Bonnie and I are working on with some tentative conclusions. Okay. So amid the increasing and catastrophic emergencies of the Anthropocene, we're seeing not only human behavior, but also the law itself beginning to reflect perhaps an old, long dismissed, but enduring moral intuition that precisely because we are profoundly interdependent, humans and animals, or obviously, if you prefer, non-human animals and human animals, because we are profoundly interdependent, our suffering is also intertwined, even similar, to the point of motivating similar responses. And I just want to lean a little bit into this point about amid the increasing and catastrophic emergencies of the Anthropocene, because the vehicle confinement law is only more and more important as temperatures around the world, but now we're talking about the United States in particular, become hotter and hotter. I was in Phoenix last month and it was 115 and 100 degrees at midnight. Right? As it gets worse, these issues will increasingly come to the fore. And we don't have to look much further to talk about wildfires, right? And saving animals and humans, floods. The Anthropocene is pushing these issues even further and further to the forefront. And it seems very likely that that will continue to show us the intertwinement between humans and animals to the point of motivating similar responses. So thank you for giving you just a little bit of a snapshot of the work that we're doing right now, but your questions, comments, criticisms will all be very helpful as we continue forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And we now have some time for questions and answers, and there are already some questions coming into the chat. So if you're watching us live, please enter your questions into the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen on the VLGS YouTube page. So, Kristen, to start us off, we have a question from Professor Winders that I think goes to the questions of these confinement laws. And Vermont was one of the first states, she says, to pass a law authorizing forcible entry into a hot car to remove a child or an animal. At an animal cruelty investigation training, the Animal Law and Policy Institute recently hosted here at VLGS, one of the law enforcement presenters noted that one needs to be careful these days because increasingly dogs are left in electric vehicles that are in dog mode or climate control, but there might not be any indication that that's the case. Um, like many of these laws, Vermont law requires one to be reasonably and in good faith believe that forcible entry was necessary, and to use no more force than is necessary under the circumstances. Do you have any thoughts on how this is actually an interesting sort of example of an almost a climate adaptation move that these vehicles are building in this technology that recognizes this risk, um, and how that the rise of EVs might change some of these considerations around this particular factual scenario.
Yeah, it's a great question. One of my students told me that she was at some electric car show in California, and there's apparently a button you can push, and a little screen comes down the back that says, "This is an electric vehicle that's climate controlled. The dog inside is perfectly fine. Do not break into this car." It sounded like a pretty fancy car, but yeah, obviously, relying on technology to save your dog or toddler's life doesn't seem like a really smart choice to me. And I think the reality is still that I didn't, read you all the conditions, but as you said, you have to have a reasonable, good faith belief that you need to, access this car in order to save the dog or the child's life. And does that mean that, we might become more and more worried if we see it's an electric vehicle and think, well, maybe it's, there's no suffering inside? You know, I don't know. I would also think that technology can also fail. And it's, hard to know how this will, how to know this heart will shake out. But it is interesting. It's sort of a attempt to ameliorate the consequences of the Anthropocene. But I think the fact that we're even having this conversation about, the lives of those who humans control, and how human dominion over them is even more potentially dangerous in the Anthropocene, and how much control we have, I think is part of the conversation that I hope we are provoking, even though I don't want to be the one that rewrites the Vermont law to take into account like climate controlled electric vehicles. I think it's part of a new conversation that I believe is ultimately beneficial. And thank you, Dulcie.
So another question came in: is there any legislation or language of critical importance in the PACT Act or the AWA that can help push these issues? As you were delivering the presentation, I was thinking about this, our complicated set of statutes that protect animal welfare, how some of them seem very resonant with this comparison, where there's, sort of a diminishing difference between the way the law treats human and non-human animals. But in this, there's also some pretty stark, stark differences in the way the law, in some of those laws and the way they've been applied and implemented, you know, influence how that comparison may or may not be in, some tension or it sort of. So I'm curious to know what you think about these other statutory contexts.
Yeah, so here's the intuition I have that is sort of leading us through this, leading us into this project, and whether it will lead us through it is, I think, another question. But that when we look at, sort of uh, highly thought out, complex legislation, the Animal Welfare Act, or other times in which courts have tried to figure out, is our animals property or something else. When the question is so front and center, we're really in kind of human domination mode. And we build legislation that makes it very clear we're at the top of the pinnacle. And yes, maybe in the AWA, we try to alleviate suffering here and there, but it's so intellectual that we use our human dominion mindset. The examples that we're looking at, that we're finding, almost cut through that edifice of what we've built up. And there's sort of the here and now, the emergency, must act fast. It's these kind of moments where you're not so much thinking, oh, well, but of course, we're at the top of the pyramid, so why should I stop and do this? But rather, you're in the moment of a crisis or an emergency situation. And those moments seem to much better yield what is something many listening to this right now might feel is the correct answer, which is that we're not at the top of the pyramid. And our attempts to be there and to control everything have actually made the planet so much worse. And so, for example, if I could just give you one more example, California, this is where the state we started with because it's where the amicus comes from, the trial, but now we're looking at all 50 states, of course. So many firefighters in California were administering oxygen to animals coming from fires. Now, they were usually companion animals, right, from the families. That there was a concern because administering first aid to an animal is veterinary malpractice if you're not a veterinarian. And so there's a statute that basically says you're exempt from veterinary malpractice as a first responder. So not anyone, but a first responder if you administer first aid to an animal, and it includes like administering oxygen, first aid, etc. Right? So you don't see firefighters stopping and saying, "Wait a minute, what does the Animal Welfare Act say?" Or, aren't we at the top of the pyramid? They're like, "No, these bodies are suffering from smoke inhalation, right? We're these humans, right? They're animals given the oxygen masks." And so it's another one of those, crucial in the moment examples. And that's why we're sort of looking at, and it's why the framing of the Anthropocene, I think, is important because we're going to have more of these kinds of moments. And we might see the reaction being one of reacting to another body, another being, another someone, rather than, how does the code characterize this goat, for example? And I tried to, in this final slide, maybe not so elegantly blend goats who are for sale at a goat auction and sort of a natural environment to sort of say like it's all intertwined and the categories our rational minds create might break down under situations of great stress.
You have one additional question, which I think fits very nicely into this observation you just made, which can you elaborate on your thoughts about the fact that these laws, at least in Vermont and California, broadly apply to all animals? You referenced this in your talk that there's not, it's not just companion animals that are covered, don't appear to include carve-outs for farmed animals, the way many, many other state laws do, especially given that elsewhere, yeah, folks have been prosecuted, for example, giving water to pigs in hot transport vehicle or otherwise trying to interfere on the behalf of animals in agriculture operations.
Yeah, so it's true that the California carve-out is not by species, but the language says, no, just to be clear, this doesn't apply to transport vehicles that are specifically made to transport, these farmed animals, right? So we're imagining the exact kind of transport vehicle that the iconic images of people giving water to the pigs through the windows. So that's an unfortunate carve out, but you can see how the legislators are trying to tackle the Walmart parking lot problem, right? And not get into every transport issue whatsoever. So why is there not species carve out? So I feel like in California, we dug as deep as we could without yet talking to some of the sponsors of the legislation, which is probably where we go next. But the reason may be anthropocentric in nature, which is if a human puts an animal, right? If a human, because these laws are about the animals, but they're also about the humans who doesn't presumably want their dog to die, although there's certainly sheer negligence running through a lot of these cases with both animals and sadly children. And reading these cases was break your heart. We forgot our child in the back of the car and forgot to drop him off at daycare. I mean, it's really heartbreaking. So yes, there is something about we're protecting the humans whose child or dog is in the car, but and so maybe there's something of, well, if a human decides to travel with their, companion chickens, taking them on with them on vacation, as probably many people do at backyard chickens. We want that animal to be protected for the animal's sake, for the human's sake, not so clear exactly. But it is just so interesting that those species are not exempt, they're not carved out of these hot car laws. And that is something that we really want to get to the bottom of, because I think a critique of this project could be, right, but the firefighters are giving oxygen to the family dog, right? Or the necessity defense that's being tested next month in California is about activists who entered a factory farm and their piglets, right? So there could be a companion animal slant towards this. My Again, my intuition is that no. We could be driving a wedge into something, much bigger that would be available to all species. But I've got to dig deeper into the question of why legislatures didn't just say cats and dogs. I believe that some states may only say dogs and cats, but I don't want to say that for certain without going further into the research. But it's
It's
a very
funny you
important
say that.
question.
It's funny you say that because the next question in the chat from Melissa is, how do you suggest an incoming 1L may be able to make progress in their own state? I'm in South Dakota, and it is limited to dog, cat, small animal. And so, and only reasonable force by an officer or agent. So there's an interesting limitation on this in South Dakota that isn't seem to be in place in Vermont and California. And I mean, I think that maybe zooming out a little bit, faced with some of these types of sort of species specific, focused on very anthropocentric view of what animals are important, what animals are worthy of our moral concern. As a advocate, as someone looking to enter this area, would be your advice as we try to make change to really, build on this moral intuition that is at the core of your work?
Yeah, so that's such a great question, and welcome to the legal profession. Melissa, was that the name of your questioner? Yeah, welcome. So there's really three kinds of laws. So the first one, which exists maybe in every state, which is you may not leave a child under 6, locked in a car in a way that might cause harm. And also usually a separate law, you may not leave an animal, it could be specified what kind, in a locked car in a way that may lead to harm. So that's the, bad actor who leaves the animal or the child in the car. The second phase is, and usually comes along with the first, is telling first responders, so officers, they may break in, right? That is part of their scope of duty to rescue the animal. And then the third phase, which I think is only about 13 states, and we had that language from California to say, you're calling 911, but these matters don't always get the police top attention. Meanwhile, the Good Samaritan is standing there watching this dog die. That's when you give immunity to the individual, right? The non-official to break open the car. Sounds like South Dakota has 1 and 2, and 2 is limited by certain species. So probably the next step then is to find, and I don't know how many animals are dying in cars, but the argument you would need to make to your legislature is that we need to follow the trend of these other states and give individuals the ability, the immunity to break into the cars with all these conditions, right? Because our first responders are not always available, or they're busy doing other things, right? Or they're not close enough to get to the Walmart, especially in a state that probably has a good amount of driving time between perhaps um, between perhaps big shopping mall areas. And if you can get that move made, then that's a chance to remove references to specific species. So you could, say, well, nine of the states that have done this have done it this way. This is good language. Let's adopt that. We don't want to preclude the family lizard. I don't know. You'd have to come up with reasons, right, as to why in this amendment moment or this new legislation moment to make other changes. But making a change to just the species is probably going to be more difficult than adding maybe a wholesale. It's not enough for first responders to have this ability. We need to allow the Good Samaritan. Our Good Samaritan fellow state citizens need to know that they can do the right thing and be protected, and lean on that, and then open it up and not just repeat the same species. So that's one way. I'll know more about the evolution of these once we sort of get through the 50 states. Melissa, get in touch in a couple of months.
I guess the the final question that I think we have as we're running close to time is if you wanted to say any more about that amicus brief and sort of the status of that case and if people want to follow that.
Yeah, so there's two cases. I'm not, as listeners should know, but of course some people aren't in law school yet. So an amicus writer is someone who's not a party to the case, is not representing a party in the case, doesn't know, what would be confidential information between the attorney and client, but is looking at an issue of law that they believe they can help aid the court in understanding based on deep research that they may have time and ability to do, and that the court itself, may not do right. But you don't tell the court they may not do it right. You're just saying, here's the best interpretation and here's the reasons why under your own law. So I had submitted 2 years ago an amicus at the trial, at the first trial level, and amicus briefs are not traditional at the trial level. So there was some scuffling about that, and ultimately it wasn't admitted, but as the defendants thought, they probably weren't going to get the necessity defense allowed to them by the trial court anyway, since there's no precedent for that in California or any state when it's an animal involved, when we're talking about an animal. So now I have it's been submitted again by a wonderful California lawyer had it submitted on my behalf. She did that, and the trials are coming up in the next couple of weeks. I could probably find some information or a site where you could follow the status of the trial, but I would say email me. I'm not sure off the top of my head what's the best place. As an amicus writer, I sort of, keep a little bit of a little bit removed from, what's the actual trial date and those kinds of things. So feel free to email myself or Bonnie, and we can provide you, or look at the website of the Animal Law and Policy Program. We'll probably say feature and put the amicus brief up for the public to see.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Kristen. This was a very fascinating talk, and thank you for your work. And we look forward to seeing how it turns out ultimately as the conclusions evolve and solidify. We are out of time for today's talk, so thanks again, Kristen, for your presentation, and thanks to all of you joining us live, and those of you watching us later. Our next talk will take place online this Thursday. So see you then, and have a good day, everyone.
Thanks so much for the invitation. Thanks for listening.